This presentation is provided by National Seafarers Academy and is designed for mariners studying for their U.S. Merchant Mariner Credential, which is also known as a U.S. Coast Guard license.
This lesson will cover rules of the road numbers 11 through 19 as a combination of the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, COL regs, and the inland navigation rules.
Section 2 covers vessels in sight of one another, and contains rules 11 through 18.
Rule 11 applies to vessels in both inland and international waters, and determines the application of rules 12 through 18 to vessels operating in sight of one another. The definition of in sight states that a vessel is in sight only when it can be observed visually. A vessel that can only be observed on radar are not considered in sight.
Rules 11 through 18 do not apply in conditions of restricted visibility or when a vessel cannot observe the other due to intervening obstructions.
Rule 12 regulates sailing vessels approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision. Rule 13 regulates the conduct of any vessel overtaking any other vessel. Rules 14 through Rule 17 regulate the conduct of power-driven vessels. Rule 18 provides a hierarchy for priority of vessel movements based on vessel category.
Rule 12 governs the conduct of sailing vessels when in sight of each other when risk of collision exists, while the vessels are in international and inland waters.
Additionally, Rule 12 does not apply if either or both sailing vessels are operating propulsion machinery or are otherwise encumbered, for example not under command or restricted in ability to maneuver.
Rule 12 when the wind is on different sides.
When each has the wind on a different side, the vessel which has the wind on the port side shall keep out of the way of the other.
An important point is that Rule 13 takes precedence over Rule 12 in overtaking situations.
This means that a vessel under sail overtaking another vessel under sail or a power-driven vessel is the give-way vessel regardless of wind or tack.
Rule 12 when the wind is on the same side.
When both vessels have the wind on the same side, the vessel to leeward is the stand-on vessel, and the vessel to windward is the give-way vessel.
Rule 12 when the wind is on port side.
When a sailing vessel on a starboard tack is approaching another sailing vessel, and cannot determine the other vessel's tack, then that vessel is directed to give way to the other vessel. Rule 12b. The windward side shall be deemed to be the side opposite that on which the mainsail is carried.
Rule 13 governs the conduct of vessels in an overtaking situation, when the vessels are in sight of each other and risk of collision exists, while the vessels are in international and inland waters.
Simply put, any vessel overtaking another is the give-way vessel. This includes sailing vessels overtaking power-driven vessels and vessels not under command or restricted in their ability to maneuver overtaking other vessels.
Overtaking vessels must also give the appropriate signals in good time, and the overtaken vessel, upon hearing such a signal, should respond.
Signals are always required under the inland rules for a power-driven vessel overtaking another. Under the international rules, signals are required for any vessel overtaking another vessel in narrow channels when the overtaken vessel must maneuver to effect a safe passage or when either vessel performs a rudder change.
An overtaking vessel is any vessel that is approaching another vessel underway from more than 22.5 degrees abaft the beam of the vessel being approached.
At night, an overtaking vessel will see only the stern light of the vessel being overtaken. Note: a vessel that may sometimes see the side light and stern light of a vessel ahead and at other times see only the stern light must assume that they are an overtaking vessel and maneuver accordingly.
Another important aspect of this rule is that if any vessel is in doubt if she is overtaking another, she must assume this is the case and act accordingly.
The vessel being overtaken must maneuver appropriately, generally to maintain course and speed, after receiving a signal. Although in narrow channels, the overtaken vessel may be required to move to effect a safe passage.
Rule 14 applies to power-driven vessels when in sight of one another and risk of collision exists while meeting in a head-on situation.
It is unique among the rules in that it mandates a particular steering maneuver to be undertaken by power-driven vessels when approaching head-on so as to involve risk of collision, that is, turn to starboard and pass port to port. Neither vessel in a head-on situation is considered to be stand-on. Both vessels are required to give way.
If there is no risk of collision, then the vessels may pass starboard to starboard.
But a power-driven vessel approaching another in a head-on situation that proposes a starboard-to-starboard passage assumes the entire risk of the maneuver, including any misunderstanding of signals.
In determining whether the situation is a meeting or crossing one, it is generally considered that if both satellites of each vessel are visible to the other vessel, then the situation is a meeting one.
Both satellites show over an arc of about 6 degrees on either side of the bow. A similar attitude of the vessels in daytime also indicates a head-on situation.
If a vessel is showing only a single green or red light to the red and green lights of another vessel, then the situation may be a crossing situation, but it is not a head-on situation. If there is any doubt about the situation, then power-driven vessels are required to assume that the situation does exist and to make appropriate maneuvers.
However, if there is no risk of collision, then neither vessel is required to turn to starboard.
Rule 15 applies to power-driven vessels when in sight of one another, and risk of collision exists, while meeting in a crossing situation.
Both vessels must be underway with at least one of the vessels having way on, and the starboard hand vessel must be on a relatively steady course. Several other situations are often mistaken for crossing situations, for example head-on situations and starboard-to-starboard passages that do not involve risk of collision. The give-way vessel in a crossing situation may take a number of actions to keep out of the way, including turning, slowing, or stopping. These actions are listed in Rule 8. The give-way vessel is cautioned to avoid crossing in front of the stand-on vessel and to avoid turning to port to avoid a vessel on her own port side. Rule 16 further requires that the action be made in good time and be substantial in nature.
It is important to note that both Rule 13, Overtaking, and Rule 14, Head-on Situations, contain statements to the effect that if there is doubt about the situation, then the mariner is required to assume that it exists and to take action accordingly.
This in doubt principle does not apply to crossing situations under Rule 15.
Under the United States Inland Rule 9 narrow channels, a power-driven vessel that is downbound with a following current on the Great Lakes, Western rivers or other specific waters designated by the Secretary of Transportation has the right-of-way over upbound vessels. The downbound vessel shall propose the manner of passage, and shall initiate maneuvering signals.
The phrase right-of-way does not mean that the downbound vessel is relieved of any liability for resulting collisions. The requirements of the rules follow long-standing customs on the Mississippi and other rivers.
Under the United States Inland Rule 14, a power-driven vessel operating on the Great Lakes, Western rivers, or waters specified by the Secretary, and proceeding downbound with the following current shall have the right-of-way over an upbound vessel, shall propose the manner of passage, and shall initiate the maneuvering signals as appropriate. Rule 16 applies to vessels in sight of one another.
Rule 16 directs that any action taken by a give-way vessel be made early enough and be substantial enough so as to be readily apparent to the stand-on vessel. Give-way vessels are specified in Rules 12, Sailing Vessels, 13, Overtaking, 15, Crossing, and 18, Responsibilities between vessels.
The requirement to keep out of the way of is stronger than the requirement not to impede as specified in Rules 8, Action to avoid collision, 9, Narrow channels, and 10, Traffic separation schemes. Rule 17 applies to vessels in sight of one another.
It requires a stand-on vessel to maintain her course and speed so long as the give-way vessel is taking appropriate action to avoid collision. Stand-on vessels may take action whenever it is apparent that the give-way vessel is not taking appropriate action to avoid collision.
Rule 17b gives a further mandate that the stand-on vessel must give way when the give-way vessel is so close that the actions of the give-way vessel alone cannot avoid collision. Rule 17c places an additional stricture on a power-driven vessel in a crossing situation to not alter course to port for vessels on her port side. Rule 17d again states the obligation of the give-way vessel to keep out of the way. Admiralty courts have stated that there are 4 stages of collision avoidance for 2 vessels that are in sight of each other and are approaching.
First stage, at long range with no risk of collision, both vessels are free to take any action. Second stage, when risk of collision first begins to apply, the give-way vessel is required to take early and substantial action to keep well clear. Third stage, when it is apparent that the give-way vessel is not taking action, the stand-on vessel is required to give the danger signal and is permitted to alter course. Fourth stage, when a collision cannot be avoided by action of give-way vessel alone, the stand-on vessel must take action to avoid collision.
Rule 18 applies to vessels in sight of one another when not directed by any other rule to take specific action. For example, Rule 9, 10, or 13.
Note that this hierarchy explicitly does not override the responsibilities of vessels in narrow channels, Rule 9, vessels in VTS areas, Rule 10, or vessels overtaking others, Rule 13. For example, this means that a vessel not under command must still give way when overtaking a seaplane, or a sailing vessel crossing a narrow channel on a western river must not impede the passage of a power-driven vessel proceeding up or down the river.
A power-driven vessel underway shall keep out of the way of
a vessel not under command, a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver, a vessel engaged in fishing, a sailing vessel.
A sailing vessel underway shall keep out of the way of
a vessel not under command, a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver, a vessel engaged in fishing.
A vessel engaged in fishing when underway shall, so far as possible, keep out of the way of
a vessel not under command, a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver.
Any vessel other than a vessel not under command or a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid impeding the safe passage of a vessel constrained by her draft, exhibiting the signals in Rule 28. A vessel constrained by her draft shall navigate with particular caution, having full regard to her special condition. A seaplane on the water shall, in general, keep well clear of all vessels and avoid impeding their navigation.
In circumstances, however, where risk of collision exists, she shall comply with Rules 4 through 19.
A wigcraft shall, when taking off, landing and in flight near the surface, keep well clear of all other vessels and avoid impeding their navigation.
A wigcraft operating on the water surface shall comply with Rules 4 through 19 as a power-driven vessel.
Rule 18 covers the pecking order of vessels.
Except where Rules 9, 10, and 13 otherwise require, you can use the memory aid. New, reels, catch, fish, sew, purchase, sum, Wednesday. New stands for not under command. Reels stands for restricted in maneuverability. Catch stands for constrained by draft, international only. Fish stands for fishing. Sew stands for sail vessel. Purchase stands for power-driven vessel. Sun stands for seaplane. Wednesday stands for wing and ground craft.
Vessels with lower priority shall keep clear. The rules in Section 3 apply to vessels operating in or near areas of restricted visibility when the vessels are not visually observable from each other due to fog, mist, snow, rain, sandstorms and like causes, in lieu of the rules in Section 2.
Mere darkness does not in itself constitute restricted visibility.
Rule 19 applies to all vessels operating in or near areas of restricted visibility.
Note that neither the hierarchy given in Rule 18, nor the overtaking, head-on, or crossing rules apply until the vessels are actually in sight of each other.
All vessels in or near areas of restricted visibility are cautioned to operate at a safe speed. Upon hearing another vessel forward of the beam, a vessel is required to slow to bear steerage way or take all way off.
This includes the situation where a vessel hears another vessel's fog signal forward of the beam. Power-driven vessels must keep their engines ready for immediate maneuver when underway in restricted visibility.
Under severe conditions, it may be advisable to anchor rather than to proceed and risk a collision. Vessels equipped with radar must use the radar to determine if risk of collision exists and must maneuver to avoid a close quarters situation in ample time. Section 3 Conduct of vessels in restricted visibility. If so, she shall take avoiding action in ample time, provided that when such action consists of an alteration in course, so far as possible the following shall be avoided.
A vessel maneuvering by radar is cautioned against turning to port for a vessel on her port side or altering course toward a vessel abeam or abaft the beam. An alteration of course toward a vessel abeam or abaft the beam.
This chart shows the difference between vessels in sight of each other and vessels operating in or near an area of restricted visibility, and vessels are detected by radar alone. Except where it has been determined that the risk of collision does not exist, every vessel which hears apparently forward of her beam the fog signal of another vessel, or which cannot avoid a close quarters situation with another vessel forward of her beam, shall reduce her speed to be the minimum at which she can be kept on her course.
She shall if necessary take all her way off and in any event navigate with extreme caution until danger of collision is over.